Hello, and welcome to Chaotic Insights, where I break down the TV show Chaotic, and maybe the TV show isn't the only thing that's chaotic. And so, on that note, welcome back to our first background. Our first location, isn't it good to be back? So, today we'll be talking about episodes 24 and 25, the Codemaster Chronicles, and the Codemaster Chronicles Part 2. So, grab a snack, start your laundry, and we'll dive right in. Episode summary. So we start this episode with a Codemaster match between Clay and Codemaster Imthor. While Clay gets brutally beaten by Imthor, our group lays the stakes and groundwork for what a Codemaster battle means. After Clay's loss, Clay picks on Tom, and while that happens, Codemaster Krellin challenges Tom to a match. Then we get the theme song, and we return to Tom disheveled as he studies and strategizes for his oncoming match. Chaos tells Tom that hearing has a great music that would help him for his match because it doubles the creature's energy. Even though he only has 30 minutes until his match, Tom agrees to go to the underworld prison to get a scan. Right before he gets the scan, Raren attacks. But after some peril, Tom gets the scan, and then he's off to his Codemaster match with Krellin. As he sets up his team, he decides to include this new music, even though he hasn't tested it yet. When he goes on to use it, he figures out that it doesn't double the creature's energy, it switches the creature's attack abilities. And it is revealed that the music was actually a setup by Clay and Christella. They were trying to sabotage Tom. And now, as they face off, Tom discovers that Krellin's strategy is to use Aryak's special ability to keep bringing back Chromax. So, Tom defeats Aryak and brings back a music, and he uses the music that he got at the beginning of the story to beat the Chromax card that kept coming back for good, and ultimately to win the match. Now, on to analysis. This episode feels like a culmination story of like everything that came before it. It really feels conclusive because we start with coming to Chaotic and learning about the game and falling in love with this Maxor card, to losing the Maxor card, to getting the Maxor card back, and now using that Maxor card to beat Codemaster Krellin, who helped him like reconcile with the emotions of losing that Maxor card. Right? It feels like a conclusion, it feels like a culmination, and the arc that Tom goes through is like being a novice player, being new, being green, being unfamiliar with the chaotic world, to now becoming an advanced player who has knowledge, who has skill, and is able to prove that by beating Krellin. And this is kind of pointed in a way where, Tom has a line about, well, a great player, and Krellin responds with, "And are you a great player, Tom?" And that is such a great line. It's so pointed, it's so like clean, and it really reads Tom. Like Tom is talking about being great, and Krellin like, boom, are you a great player? Prove it. And it chills, it's just such a great line. But Tom goes on to prove being a great player by beating Codemaster Krellin. It's not just like and are you a great player, Tom? Womp womp, no you aren't. It's about like this journey of proving himself. This episode feels like his opportunity to do that, to solidify his place as a good player with a good reputation, and he does, right? We get the, from beginning to end, we get that end piece. Now, I'm workshopping, stay with me, I'm workshopping this opinion that I think episode 25 is the right place to end season 1. Because looking forward, the next episode starts to lay some groundwork for events that take place in season 2. And I'll talk about it when we get there, but I hate where the season 1 and season 2 break is. And I'll talk about that when we get there. Like the season 1 finale is crazy, it's ridiculous. And then to start season 2 with like, it's just crazy. And so questioning where should there be a better season divide, I think it's right here. I think we had the Codemaster Chronicles. That's the conclusion of season one, right? There's no cliffhangers really. We wrap everything up, and then we get to start on a new adventure. It just seems like the best divide. And now, even though this is a complete story and it launches us into a whole new one, like there's not any cliffhangers, but it leaves that door open for something new. Every end is a new beginning, and they give us a new beginning with that Prexor Chasm scan. Now, Tom doesn't go through much of a dynamic arc this episode, but that's because he's at the end of his journey, and he's here to prove that. This episode has Tom at the top of his game, showing his best characteristics. He's brave, determined, strong, knowledgeable, clever, and humble. Like, we get to see all these attributes about him, but all of these positive attributes, and it's to prove how far he's come. He's not at the beginning of this journey where he's hot-headed and rash and, you know, jumps to conclusions. And we know he still has those traits to some extent. Like, that's who he is as a character. But in this episode, at the end of his journey, at the end of his arc, he's showing only the best that he can give. And, high compliments because as a Tom hater, I do love Tom. This is a moment where Tom really shines. Like, he is what this whole series is based on. Like, he's that central character. He's meant to be the protagonist. He's meant to be a connection point with the audience. And it all kind of cruxes on whether you, as an audience member, like and relate to Tom. And this is a moment where I think that really shines, and I think he's at his best in this episode. And that's a compliment. So, good job, Tom. Now, even though we're at the end of Tom's storyline, this is the first time we get to see a proper Codemaster match, and the writers take lots of opportunities to lay exposition for this episode and to remind people the real stakes of what a Codemaster match is and the logistics of it, how they work and how they're played. There's explanation and there's stake building. So in the beginning, Sarah says, "Have you ever seen anybody beat a Codemaster?" And that is such a good line because it opens the conversation to explain just how rare and how difficult it is to win. It establishes the difficulty level. It establishes that beating a Codemaster is something that is hard. Only really good players can do it in the best of conditions. And after seeing Clay not only lose, but not get a single win, he is completely beat in a 6v6 battle. It furthers to show how difficult it is because we understand as an audience that Clay has great cards. Clay is, do we know if he's a good player or not? Who's to say? But we know that he has great cards because he scams people out of them. He's a scammer, and so his deck is stacked with great cards. But it goes to show that even with great cards, you can lose horribly, right? There's that element of it's not the cards, it's the player. And we establish that right away in this episode with Clay's loss. So we understand that it's hard, and you need more than just good cards. That you need strategy and knowledge, and that comes later. But we also get this flashback to the last time we saw Tom and Krellin in the Betadrome, which again shows us the difficulty level and establishes the stake of this battle. If he wins this Codemaster match, he wins a rare location scan. So we understand what he wins, what's at stake. It's, a location scan, but also his reputation and his honor. So these are just some instances where they fill in information for the audience to give them a broader context of what a Codemaster match means and what it means at Chaotic. And here's the thing, these Codemaster matches draw a crowd because it's rare. This is like the Super Bowl of Chaotic, or the playoffs, if you will. The Codemaster matches, when we're watching this episode, there's a big crowd watching Tom. It's not just his friends and his enemies. It draws a crowd. Same thing watching Clay's match with Imthor. It draws a crowd because it's rare and it's special. And so it tells us about the culture of Codemaster matches at Chaotic. But ultimately, this episode is a chance to showcase cards and strategy. We see more battles in this 6v6 match than we ever have. They also explain the impact of where a creature is on the board, which is a strategic part of the game that they don't really explore in other episodes. So, just the sheer number of matches that we get to see and this more inner working of, how to play the game, this episode really is about strategy. So, in the beginning, Tom and Krellin, they clock each other for using the same strategy, putting your fiercest warriors up front to protect your strongest music casters. They call it the classic approach. You know, putting having a strong defensive line for your good, invulnerable music casters in the back. They call it a classic approach. And so that's how they recommend you as a player to set up your board. Put somebody strong in the front, have a good offense that is also a good defense for your musics, your musicians, your music casters. And so that's our first insight really on how board placement affects strategy. Then, when Maxor uses the Skeletal Steed, which is a card that allows him to jump the front line, to jump that good defensive offensive line, he goes right into the center of Krellin's board, which Krellin calls a dangerous spot for us both, which is another instance where board placement is highlighted. It highlights how being in the center of the board, he has good attack abilities. He can attack whoever he wants, but it also makes him vulnerable because Krellin also has those options. Then Krellin sacrifices Ursus in order to move a creature to protect his back line, to protect his music casters, which ultimately tips Tom into understanding that Ariak is his biggest threat. Right? Krellin why is Krellin so intent on protecting this creature if so much so actually that he moves a creature to protect it, but he sacrifices Ursus. Right in the Betadrome, the Ursus and Drawskin combination, unbeatable, right? And so Krellin sacrifices the seemingly unbeatable combination, even though Tom, figures out a way to beat it. He just sacrifices it. He throws it away because Krellin has another trick up his sleeve, and that's Ariak in the back. So that board placement really comes into not only the narrative structure of how does he figure this out, but into the gameplay itself. And a commentary on how the game is played is pretty unique to episodes like these because it's interesting how this culmination episode really focuses on gameplay because that is the core of the series and also the product that is being sold and the product that you're encouraged to buy. And so this kind of two-part episode where they really showcase gameplay is kind of an ad, but it's letting you in. It's giving you tips and tricks and pointers so that you can enjoy playing the game. You know a little bit more than if you were just to crack open the instructions and try to figure it all out for yourself. It gives you context and it gives you strategy. It gives you tips. And so once you know a little bit more, ultimately you'll enjoy your in-person experience more because it's less, okay, what am I doing? Once you get past that, okay, what am I doing stage is when you get to have fun. Once you kind of understand the game and understand how it works, that's really when the fun sets in. And so this gives you a head start on that. And that boosts this whole IP, intellectual property, as a whole. It boosts the whole Chaotic brand. If you watch the show and you buy the cards and you have a good time playing the cards because you watch the show, it just makes the whole brand identity stronger and it gives you more allegiance to it. Now, there are other examples of these gameplay lessons in this story specifically, right? We get to see Chromax's special ability, Combat Music. We get to see how Dina beats Chromax due to Battle Gear combination. We get to see how Modulation Music wins the game for Tom, or how location effects of Segri Flats makes Tom lose that individual battle, right? All examples of how different aspects of strategy affect the game, right? How music is important, how battle gear is important, how location is important, how your creatures are important, how each of your cards is a tool in your toolbox. We get that lesson all over this story. And it's just, it shows you how these different aspects of strategy affect the game. So that throws us back to the point of this episode is to showcase. It's to showcase strategy and what you can do and how you can feel connected to the game. Now, Codemaster Krellin helps with that aspect of storytelling because he is characterized as this mentor figure for Tom. He's kind, he's a teacher. He is not vindictive, he's affirmative, right? When Tom figures out his strategy, Krellin says, "Yeah, you're right, you got me." Right? He uses it as a teaching moment, as a moment of growth for Tom, right? Which is a very kind thing to do of Krellin. He, he could have said, I don't know. Tom said, "You're using the same strategy as me." Krellin could have said, "Am I?" you know, he could have casted doubt. He could have casted confusion, but he didn't. He said, "You're right, and that's good that you noticed that because that makes you better. That makes you stronger." And there's this line, there's an attack for every defense and a defense for every attack, right? And quotes like that don't come out of nowhere because Krellin, he wants to share his wisdom. He wants Tom to know that, yes, there's an attack for every defense, but that there is a defense for every attack. Like, there is no one thing that can ultimately overpower and win you the game. It's about, that give and a take. And we also get the game is not just about strategy, it's about knowledge. And this is a big part of this episode, which this mentor archetype will soon contrast when we meet another Codemaster, but Krellin is kind and a teacher, and he celebrates Tom's win. He is so proud of Tom. Like, once they finish that game and Tom wins, and you can tell that Krellin is actually trying to win. He's not giving Tom a win by any means, but he describes what Tom did and he calls it perfect. Like he's so proud of Tom in that moment of coming up with a strategy and using the knowledge at his disposal to overcome the challenges presented. And he calls it perfect. He's so proud. And that shows us how Krellin is a supportive friend. He's a mentor. And that is consistent with the first time we saw him in the Betadrome, right? He doesn't reveal he's a Codemaster right away, but he's trying to give Tom tips and give him pointers and, bestow the wisdom that it's not about the cards, it's about the player. Tom seems to have learned that lesson by the time he gets to this episode, which, he didn't right away. But Krellin comes in with those same care, with that same care, with that same, when Tom says, "I know who it is, it's Ariak," Krellin doesn't, he's like, "Okay, you got me." And that's so kind of him. And that's my analysis section. So let's move on to lore. So we do get some lore in this episode. When Krellin challenges a player, he gives them 72 hours, aka 3 days, to prepare. And even though a Codemaster match is in their respective drone, a guest Codemaster comes to referee. So that's a little bit about logistics of Codemaster matches. We learn Krellin specifically gives you 3 days to prepare, and that, even though you get the home field advantage of being the Codemaster in your drone, they still have another set of eyes looking at it. You still get a referee, you still get another Codemaster to, watch. Now, we get a little bit about Raren in this episode. Now, we see Raren. He works as a prison guard for the underworld. Okay job. And hearing mentions how he originally heard that the music that Raren had, the whole setup situation, he heard about it because Raren was bragging about getting revenge on Momark, which implies some relationship between Momark and Raren, because in order to get revenge, you have had to be wronged in some way. And this allusion to this relationship, well, we can figure out what that relationship is if we delve into the cards. The flavor text on Raren's creature card confirms that Raren was created by Momark. Now, that's a relationship. Now, how that relationship turned sour, how Raren ended up in the overworld, who's to say? But This Momark reference really alludes to his origin story and how Raren came to be. He's a Momark creature. And so it's really a throwaway line, like it doesn't affect anything. It's like, oh, hearing heard that Raren has music. Okay, we're moving the plot along. But the context around the Momark of it all really expands, it's like an if you know, you know moment. And I think that's really interesting of how the cards and the TV show work together to tell a story. And that happens multiple times, multiple ways. But it's a really subtle one that, I don't know, it kind of feels like a deep cut. I don't know. And so that's a little lore that is becomes canon through this line. Now, onto scanner lore. You know I have to talk about scanners. So, chaotic cards are formatted differently in chaotic versus in real life. So, like a chaotic card has the descriptions of abilities and it has flavor text, which is necessary information for you to play the game, right? It has like the Swift one, or it has unique, or it has range, or it says like, use this creature, sacrifice your battle gear to get 10 energy or whatever. It gives you that like logistics of how to use that card in context of the game. But at Chaotic, on your scanner, no, the art is different. The graphic design is different. So we just see the art and maybe some stats for the creature at the bottom. Or like if it's a location, you really just see the art. You don't get that description, or you don't get the initiative, or it's cataloged in your scanner in a different way. And because the graphic design is different in Chaotic, and it doesn't include the description of what each card does, that plays a part in the story of these episodes. Because Tom scans a music, and he thinks he knows what it does. He thinks, oh, this is going to duplicate my energy. And then he scans it, he gets the card, he looks at the card on his scanner, and he's like, yep, that's the music. That's the music I just scanned. It's called modulation. I was aiming for modulation. That's what I wanted. But because it doesn't have that descriptive text, Tom can't verify what it does. He has to play test the music to actually confirm its effects. So I think that's interesting because you get the name of the card but not the ability. And that's why knowledge is so important in the game of Chaotic, because you can't rely on the cards to tell you what they do or to give you information. You kind of have to figure it out for yourself, or, bring your knowledge from the online game, bring your knowledge from playing with physical cards. But if you encounter new things in Param, in Chaotic, and you scan them, you kind of have to figure it out because your card isn't going to tell you, right? Or maybe you have to crowdsource that information. And so that has a direct impact on this episode because he scans the music and he doesn't know what it does, right? If the graphic design was the same and it told him, he scanned the music and he read the text of, oh, this swaps attack abilities, he probably wouldn't have used it right away. Maybe he would have saved it for another battle, another match where he deemed it more important to use. It ultimately plays into that idea that knowledge is one of the most important parts of your chaotic experience. Now, I'm going to connect this to a personal story. So, back in the performance days, we had a show choir director that used to say, it's not about who has the most talent when you go to compete, it's about who remembers the most. At competition, who wins is not necessarily the most talented performers. It's not necessarily the people who, have that most natural ability or have the most like training. It's about who remembers the most. It's about who remembers the choreography, the facials, the angles, the transitions, dynamics, cutoffs, energy, enunciation, right? There's so many aspects that go into giving a good, well-rounded performance that, yes, like training helps you, but if you get up on the stage and you forget your cues and you forget your choreography, it's a bad performance, right? Because giving a good performance is about remembering. And specifically, when you frame performance through a competitive lens, you're graded on all these different things. You're graded on vocals, you're graded on choreography. So they have to nitpick it in a way that, has all these subcategories and whatever, whatever. But remembering all these little things adds up. And so it's the same thing with a chaotic battle. You have to, it's not about who has the best cards. It's not about who has the most talent as a player. It's not who's the most athletic or who has the best strategy going in. It's about in the moment who remembers the most, who has the most knowledge and puts it to use. Because you have to remember what cards did you put in your deck, right? You have so many music that you have scanned. Which ones did you put in? Maybe you're in a situation and you're like, decrescendo would be so good in this moment. But if you didn't put it on your deck, you can't use it. So you have to remember what music you have. You have to remember what they all do. How do you use them? What the effects of them are. You have to know the location. You have to know it geographically. You have to know the effects. You have to know how to play offense. You have to know how to be defensive. All of these things, all of these little decisions in the moment actions, they come into play. So that's Krellin's point of, it's not a game about just strategy, it's a game about knowledge because you have to remember. And the way that the graphic design of the cards is different in the real world versus chaotic frames it in a way where it's so much more important for you to know, for you to have knowledge, and for you to use that knowledge to your best ability. And that's how you become a great player. Just like Tom. It's all coming together. And then some other lore we get is obviously we get the world building about all these new creatures and all these new abilities that Krellin introduces us to. We get to see new locations, we get to see new battle gear, creatures, music, whatever. I don't even remember. I don't even remember what was introduced. He gets to show off Ariak and Chromax and whoever, whatever. you know, he gets to show off all these things, and we get to learn about them, and that's lore. That's world building, whatever. And the gag of this episode, or rather the cliffhanger of the first episode that goes into the second episode, is Chromax. Like, just the fact that he exists is like the cliffhanger. It's like, oh, Chromax is an ancestor of Maxor, and that's crazy. And so that actually gives us more lore because it confirms the biological reproduction that we kind of breezed over in the Momark episode. Like, it confirms ancestry in Param. And Chromax's design, it is similar. You see genetic similarities. They both have green skin, they both have spiky hair. But one thing about Chromax is he doesn't have the purple markings that Maxor has, which makes you go to believe that Maxor's purple markings aren't just like a skin pattern, it's actually tattoos of some kind. But it's also possible that they were introduced somewhere down the genome from Chromax. But that's an interesting thing to note. And also, using Chromax confirms the availability of using past creatures in the drum. It opens the door to that concept. They don't fully dive in right here, right now, but it opens the door. And now, it does make you wonder about rarity because once a creature comes and goes, it's much harder to scan that creature. And, you know, is it still possible? Maybe that's a conversation for the future, but Codemaster Krellin is using all of these rare cards that nobody has ever seen before to some extent. But opening that door of we can use past creatures, really my point is here, it affects rarity because maybe, in the present moment, who's a common creature? Um, Adacat. Maybe Adacat is, maybe he's common now, but then in 50 years, when he's like old or, I don't know how long a creature lives, but, say Adacat perishes for some unfortunate reason, then scans with Adacat are in a limited supply, a limited quantity, and would the rarity of that go up? You would think so. So that's interesting. And we also learn that Maxor keeps a magician in his castle, and that Maxor has a castle. So this is my last point in the lore world building that we learn, is that Maxor has a castle in Kiru City. First off, good for him, doesn't everybody want a castle? Who's to say? But even though, like, they don't really give Maxor an official title for his job, he's just kind of seen as the leader of the overworld. But the castle gives monarchy, and we kind of understand that these political systems in Param are single leader kind of systems. But the castle, we have a connection. Castles come from history and times where there were kings and queens and monarchy. So that's why the castle gives monarchy, is because of the historical connection. And so it makes you think, like, is Maxwell functionally a king? It's a good question, but they don't dive into that, so we won't either. We'll just point it out and move on. So on to fun facts. There's a couple things, a couple fun facts, a couple notes that I have. Proboscar, this is another example of a creature who has an overworld border on the trading table, but in real life is tribeless. And so this happens a couple times. This happens with Ursus, and like even with the music counters don't always line up with the creature in the show and the creature in real life. And so part of me wonders, like, you know, an overworld creature who is in the past still gets an overworld scan. It makes me wonder if they were figuring it out, or if like Proboscar just he has no allegiance really. Maybe sometimes he's feeling more overworld, sometimes he's feeling more tribeless. Did something happen? Who's to say? But I think it's a fun thing to point out. Another fun fact note I have is the skeletal steed. And my question for you is the skeletal steed in 3D? I think it is. I think the skeletal steed is animated with 3D animation, probably CGI. And I think that's funny. And I thought I would point it out to you. So next time you watch look at that skeletal steed and notice how he's animated. He's animated differently. And one last note is at the end of this episode, Tom gets a scan of Prexor Chasm, and the group thinks it's a really cool scan. Kaz has a line here where he says, think of all the fun stuff think of all the stuff that you get to scan there, right? And he says this line, and it's so genuine, and it's not in a greedy way at all. And I think it's an interesting line because it gives us a peek into chaotic culture and this friend group dynamic. And there isn't like this expectation to tag along. Like, Kaz is like, you're going to have such a fun time in Praxor Chasm when you go. And he's not expecting Tom to get him a scan so that they can do the buddy system and go for safety. Kaz is he's not being greedy, he's kind of being selfless, and he's celebrating his friend. And he's celebrating the fruits of Tom's labor. And I think that's, noble, and I think it gives us a peek and insight into chaotic culture, how, like, it isn't a guarantee that, a scan quest, you go with your friends. I don't know, there's something there. But in this moment, they also set up, Tom says there's 6 more Codemasters to beat, but right now I feel awesome. And this kind of sets up a roadmap for the series, if you will. I heard somewhere that the show Bible for this had 8 seasons. I don't know if that's true or if that's not true. But I remember hearing it, and I remember remembering it. And so if there were 8 seasons planned for Chaotic, there's 7 Codemasters. And so I think it makes sense that maybe once a season you would encounter a Codemaster, and maybe you're seeing Tom be a Codemaster each season. Maybe he's collecting his, Infinity Stones to get the Infinity Gauntlet of Chaotic. This line really sets up a clear roadmap for the series and really makes you understand what you're getting in for if you continue to watch. And if only Chaotic wasn't abruptly canceled, I would love to see I just want to see the rest of it. I love the series so much, and I want to see if this is some kind of indication for what they had planned down the line. Because they had plans. Now, my final thoughts on this episode are I really like these episodes. I tend to mix it up this episode with the next Codemaster encounter we see, and I think it's because the next one is, to me, it's more memorable, it's more thrilling, it's more compelling. But Krellin is more integral to the story progression, to the narrative arc, to the fabric of Chaotic. And Krellin is more friendly, he's a mentor, whereas later, we get this contrast. The next one is seen as more of a foe. And so for those reasons, because this one is important story-wise and because that one is important entertainment-wise, I kind of combined the two in my head. I think, oh, the Codemaster match, there's just one, and it's with Krellin, but it's the other storyline. And so I get them confused, but that's okay. I watched this one and I remembered. And so nonetheless, I like these storylines because I think the way they weave the modulation music throughout the storyline is really clever. And of course, it's such a growth moment for Tom. You can't help but be proud of him. All in all, this episode is about strategy, and I tend to enjoy the strategic aspects of Chaotic. And this episode, I feel like this is the most pure correlation to like watching sports that I can get. I could watch sports, but I'm not invested in the same way at this current moment in time. And you're watching on the screens and you get to share that story and the camaraderie with the people around you. And isn't that fun? And isn't that the point? Community. So, all in all, I like this episode. I think it feels conclusive. It's narratively fulfilling, and it's interesting. It keeps your attention, and it's good. And I like Chaotic. So, but those are my final thoughts. Let me know what you think about this episode, about Codemasters in general, all the things. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!